was a cold and stormy night. The mad scientist looked down on his operating table and saw both halves of his creation. With careful surgery, he stitched it together until...
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Okay, well, that's actually not how this story really went. SS Suevic was one of the darlings of White Star Line's colonial service, a practical but handsome cargo passenger ship that carried people and things to the most far-flung corners of Britain's empire, but she's not remembered for that. In 1907, the ship was grounded in a dramatic accident that required a full evacuation, and what happened next would go down in history as one of the strangest salvage attempts, involving a daring rescue effort, dynamiting half of the ship, and then the joining together of old and new steel. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of SS Suevic, the Franken ship. It's the 2nd of February 1907. Port Melbourne in Australia is bustling with cargo and passenger ships, all doing their part to connect and sustain the ever-burgeoning British Empire. Steamships crowd the wharves, their funnels huffing columns of coal smoke into the sky. Passengers and valuable cargo flow in and out of the docks, bound for Britain. Among those ships is the SS Suevic, whose crew are busy preparing her holds and cabins for a routine passage home to Liverpool. Passengers from all walks of life settle into cabins and prepare themselves for a slow but steady 6 weeks at sea. Once harbour conditions are favourable, Suevic steams out under the command of Captain Thomas Jones. This voyage is set to be the captain's final one after 39 years of service with the White Star Line. Towards the end of the 19th century, the ocean trade routes between Britain, South Africa and Australia connected Britain to its extensive empire. The White Star Line, an elite carrier that would one day go on to launch the RMS Titanic and its sisters, capitalised on the success of these trading routes by launching a series of modern cargo passenger ships known as the Jubilee class. In 1899, White Star Line ordered the series' 5th and final ship, the SS Suevic. Her keel was laid in early 1900, and she was launched later that year on the 8th of December. Suevic followed the same modern and robust design principles as her sister ships. They were no giants, at just 12,482 gross registered tons. Their diminutive hulls were only 565 feet or 172 metres long. In fact, there was more space allocated to the 100,000 mutton carcasses they could carry as precious cargo than the 400 third-class migrants on board. The 7 large cargo holds occupied most of the ship's bulk. The passengers could soak up simple and comfortable public spaces like the reading and writing room on the boat deck, and a general room amidships, complete with a piano and spaces to relax and chat. Less than a year after her maiden voyage from Liverpool to Sydney in March 1901, Suevic was diverted into service as a troop ship for the Second Boer War, one of Britain's bleakest and bloodiest colonial campaigns. During the war, Suevic maintained her usual South African and Australian service, only this time she chugged men in khaki across the ocean. In 1902, Suevic resumed her usual route as a White Star cargo passenger ship between the hemispheres. Apart from the routine service, she also played host to a great romance. In 1903, one of Suevic's officers was struck by Cupid's arrow when he met an Australian passenger, Sylvia Hawley Wilson. The two quickly fell in love and married the same year. That officer's name was Charles Lightoller, who would go on to serve as second officer on RMS Titanic and survive the sinking. Suevic's days on the cargo passenger service were happy, uneventful even, but she was inching towards danger. On the 2nd of February 1907, Suevic had steamed out from Melbourne under the veteran command of Captain Thomas Jones. After a stay in Tenerife in early March, Suevic headed north for Plymouth. Those who had been on board since Melbourne must have been very relieved, knowing their weeks at sea were coming to an end and they were on the home stretch. For some passengers, Plymouth would be their last stop. Such was the case for Mrs. Ireland and her daughter Kathleen. In a letter written to friends, Mrs. Ireland says that the Suevic was due to dock in Plymouth at around 2 a.m. on the 18th of March. She and her daughter would only need tolerate the high seas for just a little longer before they would feel sturdy land beneath their feet once again. So they hoped. Late in the afternoon, on Saturday the 17th, the Suevic was closer to the Cornish coast, advancing eastward along the channel toward Plymouth. The Lizard Lighthouse could be spotted just on the horizon, and by nightfall, a scattering of stars filled the night sky. The Suevic hummed through the dark waters at a relaxed pace, around 13 knots. At 10 p.m, below deck, Mrs. Ireland and Kathleen retired to their cabin to get some rest before disembarking in the early hours of Sunday morning. As their eyes grew heavy and the boat rocked them to sleep, the sky outside began to sour. The Suevic started to careen over rolling waves with frothy white caps. A southwesterly wind seethed through her rigging, battering her davits and her hull. And then a prowling fog tumbled over the Lizard Lighthouse and eclipsed the pale glow that the lighthouse had cast over the ocean. Soon a thin drizzling of rain pattered across Suevic's decks. The fog was thickening fast. Captain Jones consulted his compass and believed the ship to be about 10 miles, or 16 kilometres from the coast, Lizard Point. But in reality, Suevic was closer, much closer, only about 4 miles, or 6 kilometres from the coast. During the afternoon, the tidal pull had sneakily carried the big ship towards the shore, raising the slim margin Captain Jones believed separated his ship from land. By 10:15 p.m, the crew members on deck had spotted the ghostly hue of the lighthouse piercing through the fog ahead, but Suevic continued on at full steam, unknowingly, into the rocking shoals of the Menhir Reef. 10 minutes later, at the same time the chief engineer dashes below deck to the engine room, the men on watch frantically shout warnings to Captain Jones. Suevic's helmsman hauls on the wheel to bring her nose around to port to clear the rocks. But this will accomplish nothing. She's barely started turning when sea and sky merge into one deceptive void and her steel hull plunges onto jagged rock with a groan of metallic agony. A sickening thudder reverberates through the ship. Captain Jones urgently rings down to stop all engines and run the ship astern in the hope that this will simply haul her off the shore. The engines thrum and the propellers hopelessly thrash and bash the water into white turmoil, but Suevic refuses to dislodge from the rocks. She is well and truly stuck. One of Britain's foremost cargo passenger liners is high and dry, so close to home, and if the crew don't act quickly, the chance of survival will plummet. In 1898, the passenger ship SS Mohegan had hit the rocks near the Lizard too. She had slid off and sunk with the loss of more than 100 lives. At 10:30 p.m, distress signals rocket into the sky to alert shore stations or passing boats. Passengers rouse from their slumber and rush to their portholes to see what's rocked the boat. Mrs. Ireland is immediately pulled from the trails of sleep and eyes the time. Only 30 minutes have passed since she and her daughter had turned in. There was no way they could already be at Plymouth, she must have thought. Her heart begins to thunder and she realises something is horribly wrong. Chaos ensues as passengers, who are now awake and frightened by the distress signals, crowd the corridors. What has happened to Suevic so close to home? One account, later published in the Otago Witness, recalled how instantly there was consternation among the passengers, many of whom had been thrown out of their beds by the shock, and they rushed to the decks. Some went into hysterics, and there was much screaming. Another passenger, Hilda Tressida, recalled hearing a spectacular crash. The vessel heaved up and launched forward, she later said. For a time it shivered and shook, and the engine started again, but after a few revolutions, stopped. Hearing the distressed murmurs and thudding steps in the adjoining cabins, Mrs. Ireland wakes up her daughter just as a steward swings open the cabin door. He instructs them both to don their warmest clothes and make their way to the ship's dining saloon. After a few shakes, Mrs. Ireland pulls Kathleen from her dreams and groggily throws on her shawl to join the throng of half-dressed passengers piling into the dining saloon. The crew are handing out hot coffee and life jackets to try and keep harmony between the passengers, but out on deck, lifeboats were already in the process of being launched. The sea continues to rage black and restless below, each swell threatening to engulf a lifeboat. Then it's time for the women and children to move to the lifeboats, but the ship lurches and tilts beneath their feet with every battering wave that whacks her hull. By the time Mrs. Ireland and her daughter clamber into one of the lifeboats ready for launching, two have already gone over the side and they're fighting the swell below. With their knuckles gripping the sides, mother and daughter watch in horror as a wave picks up one of the lifeboats and hurtles it effortlessly towards the rocks. It seems almost certain that the boat will shatter into pieces, but then, miraculously, it changes its direction at the last moment, saving all on board from a horrible death. This is only a small taste of what's to come over the next 6 miserable hours. Scattering rains and brisk winds pummel the ship and its passengers, making launching the lifeboats extremely dangerous. Mrs. Ireland, Kathleen, and the other passengers in their lifeboat are forced to huddle together, suspended high above the churning waters. The crew continues to temper their fears with words of reassurance, but as minutes turn to hours, it becomes obvious to mother and daughter that they aren't going anywhere. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Captain Jones concludes that launching the lifeboats is much too risky, and it's safer just to wait for rescue instead from lifeboats on their way from the shore. The good news, though, is that Suevic doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Her bow is firmly pinched into the rock and it's unlikely to sink. Mrs. Ireland, Kathleen, and the other passengers have been shivering near freezing in the lifeboats for hours, are instructed instead to file back onto Suevic's decks. Around 4:25 a.m, 2 small boats part through the curling mist. They're a pair of Royal National Lifeboat Institution boats. There are even more on their way from the nearby Lizard, Cadgwith, Coverack and Porthleven stations. As the first lifeboat swans to the side of the ship, the fog eddies around the hull, obscuring Suevic's huge outline. Suddenly, an angry wave from nowhere bucks and tosses the lifeboat straight into Suevic's hull. Thankfully, this gives her oarsmen and the onlookers nothing but a small shock. Passengers are instructed to edge down a ladder, gripping the ropes as waves continue to batter and rock the ship and the fog licks around their ankles. But the sun finally edges above the horizon, spilling pale light across the water and, mercifully, thinning the fog. When it's time for Mrs. Ireland and Kathleen to disembark, assisting crewmen scoop Kathleen into their arms and carry her into the boat. Mrs. Ireland is told she has to scale the ladder down. She's halfway down when a sailor shouts for her to let go. For Mrs. Ireland, this may feel like a drop to her death, but she has to trust the men in the boat. With shaking hands, she lets go, but a sudden wave bucks the lifeboat and she falls with a loud thud onto one of the small masts in the middle. Her vision blurs, she can hear her daughter screaming her name and shaking her. Vague outlines of passengers hover above her, and luckily, she's relatively unharmed. She will be okay. Nearly 12 hours after the grounding, its passenger Hilda Tressider's turn to enter a boat. At the bottom of the ladder, she said, we had to wait until the boat rose on the wave. Below the ladder, an officer called, "Let go." I did, and found myself in the arms of 3 or 4 sailors who, with much encouragement and sympathy, made me comfortable. By late morning, after nearly 16 hours of ongoing effort, all crew and passengers, including 70 infants, are safely off the ship and into lifeboats, being taken ashore. It was a miraculous rescue, and it still stands as the largest number of people saved in a single operation by the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. Back on Suevic, still stuck, Captain Jones had lit his pipe after nothing short of a night to remember, and he stayed behind with 80 other men to try to salvage what they could. He received praise from passengers who unanimously paid tribute to his professionalism. If anything could stop a panic, one correspondent wrote for the West Briton, it would be a man who could keep the ash on the end of his cigar in a gale and emergency. For Captain Jones, though, there could be no escaping the court trials that must soon be coming. Meanwhile, kind locals welcome Suevic's passengers into their warm cottages, offering them biscuits and a much-needed cup of tea, before a larger ocean tug arrives later that afternoon to deliver them to Falmouth. Nearly all the passengers are running on virtually no sleep and they're exhausted from their harrowing escape. But fortunately, the White Star Line has arranged lodgings in Falmouth before their journey north to Liverpool or further on to Plymouth. It was the least the line could do, but nothing can temper Mrs. Ireland's disdain towards some of the locals in Falmouth. For her, the only thing worse than the ship running aground were the, quote, dirty and rough locals who apparently whooped and hollered at them as they walked through the streets. Very fortunately, the White Star Line had avoided tragedy. What could have been remembered as a catastrophe instead became a masterclass in seamanship. Those rescue efforts would go down in history. Among the heroes of the day was a Reverend Henry Vivian, a vicar of Cagwith and coxswain of the Cagwith lifeboat, who delivered passengers back and forth across the rock-strewn waters. He was awarded an RNLI Silver Medal for his gallantry, and the same honour was also dished out to a number of other coxswains and 2 Suevic crew members, George Anderson and William Williams. On the afternoon of the 19th of March, only a few days after Suevic had run aground, 150 former passengers arrived in London's Paddington station. As the train pulled in, nearly 500 relatives and friends crowded the platform, weeping into their handkerchiefs in relief. There were many tearful embraces as wives threw their arms around their husbands and parents grasped their children tightly after days of uncertainty. And although passengers were returning home in the rather plain and shabby clothing gifted to them by the kind residents of the Cornish coast, it didn't matter. All the passengers had returned home safely in one piece. The same, unfortunately, could not be said for the poor old Suevic. A court of inquiry into whether Captain Jones was totally at fault for the incident began on April 24th. During the trial, the captain said he'd taken appropriate coordinates for the vessel's position at noon on the 17th of March and put the ship on a reasonable course towards the Lizard Lighthouse. However, he failed to account for the tidal pull. The day before the ship ran aground, Suevic had begun to slowly drift closer to shore. But to Captain Jones, Suevic was headed in the right direction, 28 degrees east of true north, and a safe enough distance from the dangerous Mahinarie Rocks, around 16 miles or 25 kilometres. But just before 10 p.m, the weather was dark and thick with drizzling rains, and for whatever reason, Captain Jones didn't verify the position of the ship by testing the depth of the water or sounding. 30 minutes after sounding the ship's foghorns, Captain Jones could just make out the lighthouse in the distance. He assumed the ship was still at a safe distance from shore. However, seeing the light through the fog meant that Suevic was in fact just some 10 miles or 16 kilometres away, which was way too close for her to safely pass by. But still, Jones proceeded full speed ahead towards light and land, and not even half an hour later, his ship was high and dry. Considering there were no fatalities, and it was ruled that Captain Jones hadn't acted with gross negligence, the court imposed just a 3-month suspension of his master's certificate. On top of that, the court ruled that the captain's failure to register Suevic's closeness to the coast may have partly been owed to the oil-fed lamps on the ship's side and her masthead, which the court deemed as lacking penetrative power to safely and clearly light the way. But the court ruling didn't change Captain Jones's retirement plans. It really was meant to be his last voyage on Suevic anyway, and his last time commanding a ship. But that 3-month license suspension meant that his career had ended in ignominy and shame. The ordeal, however, was not over for the White Star Line, because Suevic was still lodged on the rocks. The Liverpool and Glasgow Salvage Association, acting on behalf of White Star, determined that actually 3/4 of the ship was still pretty intact, and really only the forward holds and slightly after the bridge were damaged. And it was just as well. As reported by the New York Times, only a month after the grounding, the stern was still valued at over $750,000. It housed the ship's boilers, engines, and her refrigerated cargo. If they could just lighten the weight of the ship, then maybe the rising tide could lift her clear of the rocks and allow her to refloat. Acting on this hope, in late March, Suevic's cargo was offloaded into smaller coastal freighters, and as the weight came off, her rescuers grew hopeful they might just be able to slide her free. This optimism, though, proved to be misguided. Suevic, leaning over to starboard, was now in an exceedingly dangerous position, said the New York Times. With Suevic's bow stranded and the forecast worsening by the day, the salvage group accepted they may have to abandon the ship. But not all hope was lost. The Liverpool Salvage Association had an idea, which may have taken the cake for one of the most outlandish, bonkers plans ever hatched in maritime salvage history. Rather than trying to save the whole ship, why not just try to save that roughly 300 or 400, 120 metres of the stern, what was actually still valuable? After salvage engineers had inspected the wreck, they concluded that Suevic could be cut in two, separating the intact stern from the damaged bow in an attempt to refloat that functioning section. The plan was a total gamble, but salvaging at least half the ship would be far cheaper than replacing her entirely. And so, with the bow still firmly fixed to the rocks, the most unorthodox salvage mission went ahead. So, just how do you cut a ship in half? Well, 3 weeks later, divers from the Liverpool Salvage Association descended on Suevic's wreck, fighting icy waves and hissing winds to deposit controlled charges along her forward bow section. Once the explosives were set, the men pulled hard for the shore. Soon, a thunderous blast tore through Suevic's midsection. It snapped her hull like a wishbone and sent fragments of wood and steel high into the air. After a few more days of blasts and shrapnel, the Liverpool Salvage Association men had achieved the unthinkable. 370 feet, 112 metres of Suevic's stern pulled away from her bow like meat off a bone. With the assistance of 4 tugs, the stern section was towed to Southampton, where Phase 2 of this wacky plan could begin. Shortly after Suevic slipped into Harland & Wolff's Trafalgar dry dock in Southampton, White Star Line commissioned the construction of a new bow section using the original plans. But it would take another 6 months before this 212-foot bow section was launched from the slipway at Harland & Wolff in Belfast and could be towed to Southampton. Surely this would have to be one of the most unorthodox ship launches of all time. Meanwhile, Suevic underwent probably one of the most innovative operations a shipyard had seen. Using oxyacetylene cutting torches, the shipyard workers sheared away the torn and twisted steel at the forward end of Suevic's broken stern. Plate by plate, the edges were shaved back until it became a clean and uniform edge. Once that steel edge was squared and trimmed, the yard workers moved in with pneumatic drills to punch new rivet holes through the hull plating and into the frames. This was a step that could make or break the whole plan. Each hole had to perfectly match the measurements and dimensions for the replacement bow section, so the ship could be basically stitched together, or else Suevic was destined to be two halves of a broken ship that didn't fit. Further inside the hull, yard workers checked, straightened, and reinforced the structure, adding temporary beams in preparation for the arrival of the other half. Finally, in late October, it was the moment of truth. Suevic's new bow section arrived at the Trafalgar dry docks and slowly inched forward until the blunt after face of the bow lined up with the stern's freshly cut edge. The yard workers were now faced with the daunting riveting task. With the new bow and the old stern facing each other, it was showtime. Teams of riveters worked across the ship, following each other's rhythm. On one side of the hull, the workers heated and fed the rivets through the holes, while on the other side, bucking crews hammered the rivets flat. The rivets cooled and tightened, locking the metal together like steel and iron knitting. By January 1908, after thousands of rivets, volumes of sweat and tears, and a historic reconstruction, the SS Suevic was reborn.
It's alive!
Against all odds, the ship returned to sea. For the next 6 years, Suevic continued to steam between Liverpool and Sydney through Cape Town. But with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, she was requisitioned again as a troop ship. She became His Majesty's Australian Transport A-29. Throughout the war, Suevic carried troops for Gallipoli, delivering the infantry unit of the Australian Imperial Force to Egypt, and returned wounded soldiers home to Australia after the signing of the armistice in November 1918. In 1922, with the rollout of the British Empire Settlement Act to inspire mass migration to the British colonies, Suevic was back in the passenger business. Packed with migrants chasing new lives in Australia, Suevic ran on a tight schedule. But in 1928, the White Star Line let the old ship go, and she was sold to a Norwegian company who redesigned her as a whaling factory ship. Suevic became Skitteren, and her passenger spaces were replaced with boilers, vats and storage tanks that could hold up to 80,000 barrels of foul whale oil. For most of the 1930s, she roamed Antarctic waters, generating staggering quantities of whale oil at the height of the industry. But Suevic's end finally came in 1942, when she was poached by the British once again for the doomed Operation Performance during the Second World War. Britain needed merchant ships to carry fuel, food, and essential supplies across the Atlantic as the Allied war effort heated up. On the night of the 31st of March 1942, 10 Norwegian ships, Skitteren included, left the neutral waters of Sweden bound for Britain, but German warships descended on the fugitives like a ravenous pack of wolves. Only 2 ships made it to Britain. The next day, when they were faced with capture, Skitteren's crew decided to scuttle her. The charges were set, the crew abandoned ship, and moments later, Skitteren was blasted to smithereens. She slipped beneath the surface, broken and smouldering, and it marked the end of a career that had spanned 4 decades, global wars, and more than 1 or 2 reinventions. She now lies on her side at a depth of 74 metres or 242 feet off the Swedish west coast near the city of Lusitania. At one point, Skitteren's wreck was dubbed a grave environmental hazard by the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management, thanks to the large amounts of oil still in her hold, but salvage efforts have since remedied this. Suevic had a very impressive and very long career, but her shining moment surely has to be when she ran aground at Lizard Point in 1907. Those highly professional rescue efforts, coupled with the cool and collected demeanour of Captain Jones, and the kindness and the hospitality of the locals, had led to the miraculous survival of all 524 people on board. Not a single life was lost, and the innovation and the ingenuity that had followed, however outlandish, saw the White Star Line entrust salvors with blowing up Suevic's bow that was still stuck on the rocks and preserving the ship's stern for another 30 years. It surely has to be one of history's greatest maritime legends. The time half a ship was saved, Frankenstein back together, and put back into service.